Did you know that not all slave owners were white? Or that some enslaved people actually owned slaves themselves? What about the fact that white Americans were trafficked into slavery by other white Americans? These aren't the stories you usually hear. But they're real, documented, and more common than most think. Selling books about the horrors of black enslavement has become a profitable industry. These books often expose the brutality of slave masters and shatter the myth of the benevolent owner. But there's a major omission. They rarely mention that slave ownership was widespread, and not limited to white people. The involvement of non-white slave owners doesn't excuse the crimes of white ones. But ignoring it creates a simplistic and distorted view of slave societies. Long before slavery became entrenched in the American South or Caribbean, it was already a recognized and legitimate business across many parts of the world. Some freed black individuals didn't just oppose slavery. They embraced it. They saw it as a pathway to status and wealth. Historical records show that many ex-slaves were willing participants in the system. The Bourne family in Barbados, descended from slaves, went on to own slaves themselves. William Bourne, his son London, and other relatives considered slaveholding central to their identity. They even pushed back against the idea of abolition, arguing it would harm their interests. In Jamaica, John Williams, a former slave, rose into the slaveholding class. He used his status to lobby for laws preventing enslaved people from testifying against him. His son, Francis Williams, owned 15 slaves when he died in 1762. This wasn't rare. Research shows that black slave owners in the American South were not anomalies. Southern whites were only 3 times more likely than blacks to own slaves. And nearly 27% of black slave owners held slaves for commercial, not compassionate, reasons. Some black slave owners did by relatives out of compassion. But even these situations could turn dark. There are accounts of black owners selling spouses, parents, or children after disputes. In one case, a son sold his father for scolding him. Compassion had its limits. Historical accounts suggest that black or mixed-race slave owners were sometimes even more brutal than white ones. Ulrich B. Phillips wrote about this perception. Anthropologist M. G. Smith noted that the harshness of free-colored owners towards their slaves is remarked upon by all our sources. The record contradicts sanitized narratives that portray black slave owners as universally benevolent. Even more surprising, some enslaved people owned slaves themselves. In Africa, elite slaves often accumulated wealth and purchased their own slaves. These holdings typically transferred to their masters upon death, but ownership was still legally recognized. In Brazil, enslaved overseers could build wealth, buy slaves, and eventually purchase their own freedom. The Crimean Khanate even had legal structures that allowed enslaved people to own other humans as a way to fund their emancipation. Slavery was a complex institution with multiple layers of dependency, exploitation, and cruelty. Yet while the impact of the transatlantic slave trade on Africa is heavily researched, the experiences of white victims of slavery are far less studied. Viking raids across the British Isles in the medieval period led to the abduction and sale of tens of thousands of white slaves to Arab traders. Cities like Cork, Dublin, and Wexford became major departure points. No one was spared: peasants, aristocrats, even bishops. A 10th-century Arab chronicler noted the presence of European slaves in Arab militias and harems. These raids devastated local communities. They drained resources, collapsed political systems, and stunted population growth. Yet they're largely absent from today's mainstream historical discourse. The story doesn't end there. In the 19th century, white Americans were also trafficked into slavery by fellow Americans. Historian Carol Wilson uncovered cases of poor whites kidnapped and sold into illegal slavery. Free African Americans sometimes participated in this trade, exploiting the vulnerable status of poor white workers. The scandal was real enough to be addressed by prominent abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, who wrote that the kidnapping of white people into slavery was not uncommon. This part of history is rarely mentioned. Some abolitionists even used white slavery as a reason to push for the complete abolition of slavery. Carrie Lee Merritt, in her book Masterless Men, explains that the supposed racial and legal lines separating black and white, slave and free, were far more blurred than people like to admit. The dominant narrative insists that only black people were victims of slavery, and never its perpetrators. But the historical record tells a more complex story. If people are granted benefits today because their ancestors were enslaved, then shouldn't the descendants of enslaved whites, those captured by Vikings, traded by Arabs, or sold in America, be eligible too? History isn't black and white. It's messy, uncomfortable, and full of contradictions. And it deserves to be told honestly.